This episode of New Politics was released on the 7th of December, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the media reporting on a rift between Anthony Albanese and Tanya Plibersek that doesn't really exist. The Australian Greens propose an alliance with the Labor Party, but the Labor Party is not too happy about this. The Liberal Party attempting to woo back voters from the teal independents by abusing them. And it really is time to dump neoliberalism. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, new French Prime Minister.
And David, we've got some very good news. We've got a new book coming out and it's our annual review of politics. And this year the book is titled The Age of Disappointment, the Review of the Year in Australian Politics. And it is a collection of all of our essays published throughout the year. It's 404 pages of action-packed material and it's got over 60 chapters. And a few people have said to us that that's far too many chapters, but I actually think that it's not enough chapters. We need to have some more in there. But aside from that, we've called the book The Age of Disappointment because politics promised to be so different, but it seems to have slipped back to business as usual. And there's a whole lot that could be done to make society better and the economy and the environment so much better, but we're back to the days of bickering, blame shifting and plain dumb politics. And I think that we've got very good reason to be disappointed.
It's been a very strange year in terms of Australian politics. And we've had, in many ways, a very strange Labor government. And looking at it over the last 12 months hasn't made it any less strange. Sometimes we've found that stuff that didn't make sense in February made perfect sense in November. But this year it seems that the stuff that didn't make sense in February still doesn't make much sense. We do our best to make sense of it. But it's a year that will be remembered for its unusual results and approaches rather than for its wide and expansive reforms. And also for those who think that 60 chapters is too much, you don't have to read all of them at once. You can cherry pick and read them bits at a time. And I say this every time we do a book. I think this is the best one we've done so far. But I genuinely believe that. I think all of our books are fantastic, if I do say so myself. This one is, I think, the best of them.
And The Age of Disappointment, it is available through Amazon. And if you don't want to go through Amazon because you don't like Jeff Bezos, because he's an evil oligarch, well, it will be available on other lesser evil oligarch outlets soon. And if you want to avoid all of those evil people completely, you can purchase the book directly through us at newpolitics.com.au. And the good news for our paid subscribers at Patreon and Substack is that you will receive a free ebook copy of the book, and we will be sending that out soon. And of course, David, this is just another good way to support independent media and support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
Are you looking for it? You'll hear it from me.
There's media speculation about a split between the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the Minister for the Environment Tanya Plibersek, and it might be a case of the media chasing a story that just does not exist. And this all started after Anthony Albanese intervened in the nature positive legislation that had been negotiated with the Australian Greens, and he decided to withdraw the legislation. And that legislation also enables the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Environmental Information Office. And just putting aside the merits of doing all of that, because it's a pretty poor decision to be doing this and seem to be at the behest of the mining industry in Western Australia, but essentially this is what Prime Ministers can do, and they actually do it more often than we read about. And there's been a lot of suggestions that Albanese did this because he sees Tanya Plibersek as a leadership challenger and that he wanted to put her in poor light. And yes, Albanese is quite petty with things like this, but I don't think he'd do it for those reasons. And yes, Tanya Plibersek is a potential leader for the federal Labor Party, but this is not like the Hawke-Keating leadership tussles in the 1980s or Howard Peacock for the Liberal Party or the Rudd-Gillard debacle in the 2010s. It's something completely different. And once again, we see how the media fails. Now, for a start, there is no position vacant. 75% of caucus is needed to vote for a leadership spill. There's been absolutely no agitation for a leadership change within the Labor Party, and it's unlikely to happen 6 months before a federal election. Although Labor did replace the Prime Minister less than 6 months before an election, not once, but twice, and David, scientists are still trying to work out why on earth the Labor Party decided to do that, not just the one time, but the second time. But aside from that, this might be a case of what the American journalist Walter Cronkite once said, that in Australia, there's too many journalists and just not enough news.
It's a strange thing. Certainly, on the face of it, it would have been a very disappointing result for Tanya Plibersek, who'd worked pretty hard in getting this stuff up, and then to find that it didn't get up. Having said that, that's politics. All kinds of things don't get up for all kinds of reasons. And it's easier for journalists to look at a potential personality issue than it is for them to actually look at what other reasons there might be. And of course, if you're working for the organisations that were probably behind it, you're going to try and distract from the real reason, that it was pressure from Western Australian mining rather than any internal Labor pressure or any internal tensions between two members of Parliament. The Labor factions are arcane and difficult, and if you're not in it, can be confusing. Even when you watch this stuff closely, Labor factions can be seemingly far more confusing than they perhaps should be from an outsider's perspective.
Oh, but I think that that's confusing for the people that are part of those factions as well.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, there are power struggles within factions, and it just goes into the fun of analysis. Looking at the tensions, whether real or perceived, between the Prime Minister and the Minister for the Environment is not really looking at the full story, and that there's a much more accurate and I think far more interesting story when we bring in other stakeholders like the mining industry and bored journalists looking to fill the copy for a 24-hour news cycle.
Oh, well, I'm not trying to deflect from the performance of the leader or the performances of any leader, because there's always going to be internal pressures on leaders, and because of how the Labor government is performing at the moment, and it's not terminal, far from it, but there'd be internal discussions about Albanese all the time and how to improve his performances and what to do with him at this stage. But they would have learned from the disasters in 2010 and 2013. Well, you'd hope that they would have learned from those disasters, that removing the leader of the Labor Party is always electoral poison. And the media definitely make sure of that. Not so much when the Liberal Party changes their leaders, or there's leadership speculation in the Liberal Party. That's always presented as something that just had to be done. And we saw that when Tony Abbott was removed, and then when Malcolm Turnbull was removed, that was all fine. But when Labor does it, it's the collapse of the entire world as we know it. And I'm pretty sure that Labor MPs would be well aware of this. And I can absolutely predict now how all of this is going to play out in the media over the next 6 months or so. All of this stuff about a vote for Albanese is a vote for Jim Chalmers or a vote for Tanya Plibersek, which in my opinion might be a good thing anyway. And also those questions about how long is Anthony Albanese going to stay in politics for? Is he going to retire to Copacabana with Jodie Hayden? And there's also questions now being put directly to Jim Chalmers about whether he should be the leader after the next election, if not beforehand.
In what circumstances would you seek the leadership?
I can't see any circumstances, frankly. You know, my goal here is to be a good treasurer in a great Labor government which is led by Anthony from start to finish. You know, that's my objective. And when I reflect on that, or occasionally when I'm asked about that by people like yourself, you know, I'm quite proud of the decision that I took in 2019 to support Anthony for the leadership. I think that decision has been vindicated.
Labor, of course, always has to be politically careful about these types of processes, because the media will always navigate towards a narrative that is all about division within the Labor Party, and even when the division is not there, they'll navigate there anyway and make stuff up. And there's no question that Tanya Plibersek would have been so pissed off about this, having the legislation being pulled at the last minute, but this is also the nature of politics, as you suggested, David. And she's been very professional in her responses about this, which is what you'd expect. But this focus on a rift between Albanese and Plibersek and this so-called leadership speculation, I think it's shifted the attention away from the fact that key legislation that would have been good for environmental protection has either been stalled or removed for good. And that's what the real story is, not some made-up story about leadership speculation that just does not exist.
It's...
journalists have missed the main story. That's the point that I'm putting out.
Journalists have missed the main story, as they so often do in Australia. And I think Walter Cronkite's observation, too many journalists, not enough news, is absolutely true. And we can see this when you look at our 24-hour news cycles. They basically repeat every 4 hours 3 or 4 times because there's just not enough that happens. Or there's enough that happens, but our journalists don't cover it because they're all fighting over the same little bit of ground. Now, there are honourable exceptions, mostly in the smaller outlets, even in some of the bigger outlets. But certainly to hear and to read the same old talking heads spout the same old stuff again and again and again gets boring and repetitive. And I think there's probably a lot of substance in these reports of what happened, but we're not getting them. And I think some enterprising young journalist may make a career for themselves by digging into the whys rather than the hows. And journalists stopped asking why, or seem to have stopped asking why, and instead of asking how. And of course, how is an easy question. It can be important, but generally in politics, why is the better question.
And I also noticed that the Australian Greens have actually been quite pleasant about this idea of Albanese withdrawing the nature positive legislation. And I think that's because now they can paint the Prime Minister as the real blocker. He's the guy who had this legislation on the verge of being approved, and then he intervenes and blocks it. So I'd say they're doing this partially to negate all of the attacks on the Australian Greens for being the blockers on federal housing reforms. And the withdrawal of this legislation at this stage, I think it's quite stupid politically, because the government can't push the message of being the party of the environment when it's opening up all of these new coal mines across Australia, new gas fields. They recently refused to assess 2 mines in Queensland and 1 in New South Wales for their potential impact on climate change. They just simply refused to do that. And now they've stalled on the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Environment Information Office. And you can't really run an election campaign outlining how great your environmental credentials are and then say, oh, by the way, look at these wonderful coal mines that we've opened up and the new gas fields as well. And have a look at this wonderful empty building that was meant to house the Environmental Protection Agency, but we decided to scrap that. I don't think that's a really good election message to run with. So it's a very strange decision. And that narrative was that it's because the WA government put an end to it, because they've got an election coming up in March next year. But the WA government, they hold 53 of the 59 seats over there. So it's hard to see them losing that election. I'd say that Albanese is probably worried about losing seats in Western Australia at the federal election, and he doesn't want to do anything to upset the mining industry. And then the other issue has to be, well, why was this on the verge of being announced just 6 months before an election? And if Albanese did think that it was going to cause problems in Western Australia, well, it should have been announced a long, long time ago. The nature positive legislation and Environmental Protection Agency, well, that should have been in place a long, long time ago, not in the shadows of an election campaign.
We might put it down to inexperience. We might put it down to over-enthusiasm of a new government. We might put it down to incompetence. There'd be some out there who would put it down to corruption. It's very hard to find a positive spin on this. And the government has burnt most of its political capital. So the more it moves down these types of roads, the less it is able to weather the storm of the negativity that comes from it. So I think they need to work out what to do very quickly.
The Australian Greens have proposed a formal power sharing arrangement with the Labor Party, and This is in preparation for the possibility of a minority government, which most people agree is the most likely election outcome in 2025. Here's what the Greens leader Adam Bant had to say about this.
It should be a stable, effective and progressive parliament. And I think there would be a lot of merit in knowing from the start what the reforms are that could be achieved in that parliament. And I think working that out in advance, working out what the benefits will actually be for people and knowing how then the next 3 years would map out, that's probably the priority. And I think from there, it could take all sorts of different forms.
And this is what we'd expect from mature politicians and leaders, to look at the proposals and discuss them on merit, but instead of looking at the potential benefits, not just for the Labor Party, but for the Australian Greens and for the entire parliamentary system, the government's response has been quite hostile and dismissive, and the outrage that they've shown is almost like the Labor Party thinks that it's considering a partnership with the Liberal Party or One Nation rather than a like-minded progressive party. Here's the Labor Senator and Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher.
We're not planning on that. Well, I mean, we will go into the campaign seeking majority government. We will be explaining why we think that is important to provide certainty, particularly in these difficult economic times, and that is what we will campaign for.
And of course, there's no point in making deals before you know what the results of the next election are. And all parties are out to maximise every single vote that they can get. But you can have all of those discussions beforehand. It doesn't have to be done in public. And I'm sure that there'll be a lot of backroom discussions about all the what-ifs in the lead up to the next election, because there's a very good chance that the next election will result in a minority government.
One thing we do know is that all the parties do their own internal polling, and they generally have a very good idea of what the election is going to look like. And sometimes they have a better idea than the polls that us on the outside get access to, partly because the polls that the parties do are much more specific in terms of the questions that are asked, because there's no real interest outside the party to ask these questions. So if the Greens have started negotiating or trying to start negotiation, it suggests that their internal polling suggests that they will be in a position to have some say in the next government. Now, of course, internal polling can be wrong too, but it's not at all a bad move for the Greens to start the process now and try and get as much leverage as they can before the final numbers, that is the numbers of the election, come out.
Oh, and I thought that we've been trying to reach a point in politics where politics is more civil and more mature, and that's certainly what Anthony Albanese said that he wanted to achieve when he first became Prime Minister. And then when there's an opportunity to show this civility, all of these approaches are shunned or dismissed. And we have to remember that Anthony Albanese was hostile to the Teal's independence on the crossbench when he first became Prime Minister. He's always been historically dismissive of the Greens, and I really don't know what would be part of those negotiations because the situation hasn't arisen yet. But the ACT Labor and the ACT Greens, well, they had a power sharing arrangement up until this year, and that existed for 12 years. And we don't hear very much about this in the media, but you can agree on certain issues in principle. But there's probably no chance of any of this happening before the next election. And there's also been suggestions that the current Labor government is spooked by the power sharing arrangement that they had with the Greens in 2010. And I realise that there's all that debate about the emissions trading scheme and the carbon pollution reduction scheme, and that belief that the Greens were the cause of the Labor government's election loss in 2013. But no, I don't think that's the case at all. I think if they wanted to blame anyone, well, they can blame Paul Howes, Mark Arbib, Carl Bitar and Bill Shorten for all of that, and all of those other Labor Party hacks for the 2013 election defeat. But probably best not to go down that rabbit hole yet again. But we can see that in this case that deals are always going to be ruled out until deals have to be made. And I can't imagine Anthony Albanese saying after the next election, if they're in a minority government position, if it does come to that, he's not going to say, well, we will be able to form government with the Australian Greens, but we're not going to do that because we'd much rather sit on the opposition benches for the next decade and let the Liberal Party be the government of the day. I just cannot see that happening at all. There will be a deal if there has to be a deal.
I'm a bit less. We've seen Labor before shoot itself in the foot and stay in opposition because it suited those in power to retain their positions more than it did for them to go into government and see them lose their positions. And this is a big problem with the more progressive side of politics. The status quo will do anything, include undermine the interests of their own party, to stay in power. Now, this isn't everybody, and I know that you're all shouting, but there's so and so. I'm fully aware of the good and noble people. But it's funny how Labor would rather keep its entrenched positions in opposition than share them out amongst more stakeholders in government sometimes. It's not all the time, but sometimes. And I guess it's part of being a very established party that the vested interests will remain. We see it in the American Democrats too. We see it in the British Labour Party. They would rather undermine their far more progressive candidates so that the more small c conservative members retain their positions rather than see the party itself remain the party of government. I think there's an interesting psychological study in there, why people would rather keep their little empires going at the cost of being able to affect real and proper and permanent change and positive change to the country. It defeats me in many ways.
On this sort of relates to what we've been discussing, but there is new research from the Australian National University that suggests that confidence in the federal government is almost as low as it was in April 2022, and that was just before the Morrison government was booted out of office. Now, that does not mean that the Albanese government will follow the same fate, but there's just not enough consistency in this research to make a link with direct electoral outcomes. And for me, this is quite surprising, this research, because while there are disappointments with the Albanese government, and David, we've written an entire book about this, they are nowhere near as corrupt or as incompetent or as disorganised as the coalition was for most of their time in office between 2013 to 2022. And we won't find out until the next election to see that link between this research and electoral outcomes, but I just don't think that it's a case of the government mismanaging the economy. They are doing well in the circumstances that they have inherited, but the economy is not performing according to expectations within the electorate. And that also gets back to that basic issue generally within politics, that if the economy is performing well, it doesn't matter who is in office, they will be rewarded. Not always, but usually. But if it's not performing well, the government will be punished for it. And again, not always, but usually. And there's always the possibility that economic circumstances will improve over the next 6 months. But based on what we know now, that's why there's a lack of confidence in this government. And that's what the ANU research seems to suggest.
It's really odd too. Like, we've got all kinds of contradictory figures coming out. On one hand, we have a cost of living crisis. Prices are right up. We have a rapacious and profit-driven supermarket sector. We have a banking sector that they've stopped being banks and have become investment houses. We have low wages, slightly higher unemployment, although the unemployment rate is dropping. Against that, we have inflation dropping. We have record spending in the recent sales and a projection for record spending at Christmas time. Taken separately, all these things can point to a great economy or bad economy. Taken together, none of it makes a lot of sense. You can't have a bad economy and record sales. You can't have low inflation and prices going up. We've got perceptions, I think, and we've got data. And the two of them, I don't think, are necessarily supportive of each other at the moment. And how this affects the government is that if the government is seen to have not managed the economy well, despite the fact we have a very good treasurer in Jim Chalmers, and of course we've got a press that does not want to see Jim Chalmers succeed as treasurer, and his abilities and even reputation far surpass the last three treasurers of Frydenberg, Morrison and Hockey, none of who were any good at all. We're in a spot where they're either doing very well or they're doing very badly, and it can't be both.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
There's also dramas on the other side of politics, and the senior Liberal Party MP, Paul Fletcher, has decided that the best way to win back those seats lost to the community independents, especially the teal independents, is to abuse the electorate, claim that they've all been conned, and that this con is part of a big Greens climate change conspiracy.
We hear plenty of talk that a parliament filled with teals, or as they call themselves, community independents, is a good thing. I'm here to argue that it's unambiguously a bad thing. The teals are a giant green left con job. I want to look at the track record of the teals in Parliament and the disconnect between what they promised and what they've done. I want to argue that majority government is a good thing, but it is at real threat due to the teals. Let me turn first to the giant green left con job perpetrated on the Australian electorate by Melbourne billionaire's son Simon Holmes à Court and a group of other wealthy people.
And I wonder if that's anything like the giant right-wing con job perpetrated on the Australian electorate by Gina Rinehart and a group of other wealthy people. But just on a human behavioural response, abusing people and telling them that they've all been tricked and conned is probably not the best way to get them to go back and vote for the Liberal Party. And Paul Fletcher's seat in northern Sydney is at the risk of falling to an independent. At the 2022 federal election, he had a 12% swing against him from the independent, Nicolette Buller, and he only holds the seat now by 4%. And I'd say that if this is the best that the Liberal Party can offer to sandbag against the rise of the teal independents, he may as well give up right now, because the Liberal Party is going to lose that seat of Bradfield, and they're probably going to lose a few more seats to independents in other parts of the country.
I suppose there's two ways of beating the teals. And hello to our teal listeners. One is to do the work of a local member. Show up, defend your constituents, listen to the concerns of your constituents, work extremely hard to make sure that those concerns are alleviated. Look at what's needed in your local electorate and lobby your ministerial colleagues, and in this case the opposition, to go in and try and solve the problems of the country. You might want to add positively to the debate on how Australia should go by giving positive and competent speeches to various groups, writing books and papers. Or you could just whinge that it's a conspiracy. Now, which one's going to get you more votes? I might be dumb, but I suspect the former. And the time to have started that was when you were first elected to Parliament. The second you see IPA, you realise that this is a guy who didn't have much future, who has been picked up by essentially the charity for useless conservatives who are unemployable, and they get them jobs as a research assistant at the IPA, or they get them, none of these, or very few of these, actually work in the big IPA funding companies. They always work for the IPA, then they get a safe seat. And you might say, yes, but Labor, it's all union. But you still have to have competence and productivity as a union representative. You don't last if you don't put a few runs on the board. But at least on the progressive side of things, if you've started in the union, it meant you've generally started trying to do productive and good things. Whereas if you start with the IPA, you've just churned numbers that are meaningless and inadvertently, let's be generous, inadvertently deceptive. And there's been no productivity or achievement. And Paul Fletcher is almost the poster boy, except he's not charismatic enough to be used as a poster. And to come out and say to the electorate, you're too stupid to vote for me. If the electorate says, hey, he's right, we should be smart and vote for the guy who's done nothing for us the last 12 years.
Well, that's an inherent contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah, if he loses his seat, I won't feel terribly sorry for him. We'll put it that way.
Oh, well, I don't want to be too harsh, but Paul Fletcher does have the personality of a lamppost and the ideology to match that as well. And the only reason he's been in politics for so long is that he's been in the safe seat of Bradfield. And it was a very safe seat up until the last election. And that was when Nicolette Buller ran against him as an independent. And that wasn't such a high-profile campaign last time, but now she's got a much bigger profile, and I think that she's got a much better chance of taking that seat off the Liberal Party. And of course, each seat that the Liberal Party loses in the next election, that means that they have to win another seat somewhere else just to make up for it. And I think this whole episode with Paul Fletcher, it just goes to show how the Liberal Party have taken the electorate for granted for far too long. And the Labor Party, of course, they do that also. The community independents, well, they convey a message of positivity. And this is what is appealing to the electorate at the moment. The electorate just wants to see politics done differently. And having some old sad sack Liberal Party MP haranguing the electorate for not voting for him, I just don't think that message is going to work very well at all. And you just wonder, when is the Liberal Party finally going to get the message? You know, have a look at all the MPs sitting on all those seats that they've lost. That's what the electorate is after. And maybe if they lose a few more seats to the community independents at the next election, maybe that's when they'll finally start getting the message.
You'd have thought that they'd have got the message when they lost nearly every single one of their blue ribbon seats. No Liberal holds a seat at a federal level within the view of Sydney Harbour. There is no metropolitan Melbourne. It's only when you get to the very outer suburbs of Melbourne that you get Liberal Party people. They're in crisis, absolute crisis, and they're not dealing with it properly. Instead of saying, how do we win back Kooyong? How do we win back Wentworth? How do we win back, well, not North Sydney because it's been abolished, but how do we get those seats? It's like they've said, this worked for 50 years, we're going to make sure it works again. And of course, 50 years ago, it might have worked. It's Rocky and Bullwinkle with this time for sure, with the magic trick. Beating your head against the wall and not realising that it feels much better when you stop. And as a student of Australian politics, it's distressing in a way to watch a once great party, and a party that had major achievements, the expansion of the universities, the Colombo Plan, introduction of the old age pension, its treatment of women historically, and we need to contextualise this a bit, was very good. It had the first female member of the House of Representatives, the first female minister. You know, this is a party that has some very worthwhile and good and proud achievements. And I say this as someone who doesn't vote for them, but also say this as someone who believes, one, credit where it's due, and two, that you can't argue the fact of history. You can argue the interpretation of the fact of history, but you can't argue the facts of history. And to watch it devolve into a incompetent clown show, which it's been doing since at least 1996, is upsetting. Even if I do want to see it lose every election, I still think that a party that was capable of great things should be grieved when it is declining in such a way and being taken over by fourth-rate mediocrities, con artists, spivs, and incompetents.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
And we are jumping around a little bit, but I think that all roads are leading back to the one spot. One of the world's leading economists, Joseph Stiglitz, has put out the message that the major progressive political parties all around the world have to dump neoliberal economic policies and reverse the trends from over the past 40 years or so, which have led to greater inequality, a lower level of life expectancy. It's led to unaffordable housing, wages have gone down and inflation is up. And the original idea that was pushed by the neoliberals, and that's all of those people from the Chicago School of Economics, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and then taken up all around the world by many governments, the idea was that neoliberalism and that trickle-down effect would grow the economic pie and everyone would share more of the pie and we'd all live happily ever after. And of course, that didn't really happen. The economic pie did grow and became much bigger, but fewer people ended up getting more of that share, and inequality has become quite drastic. And there's a wide range of other issues related to unbridled capitalism that have pushed the economy and the environment and the society to the edge. And David, we've been advocates for global economic change for some time, and We thought that with the onset of COVID in early 2020, well, that might have been the time for this change to occur. Now, that didn't happen and is unlikely to happen in the short term, but there are many thinkers all around the world that believe that it's time for a new form of Keynesianism to become the dominant form of world economics. But unlike in the early 1980s, when neoliberalism had Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to champion their cause, well, there are no strong advocates at the moment. The United States has got the Trump Republicans in office for the next 4 years. They're unlikely to make any changes at all. So it looks like the economic system that is needed to address today's economic problems all across the world, well, that will remain unchanged, and new thinking will just have to wait for a few more years.
It's one of the great con jobs. Oh, if you give us all the money, it'll trickle down. It did not trickle down. The legacy of neoliberalism is the fact that people are working 38, 40, 45 hours a week in 2 or 3 jobs and still can't afford to live in a level of frugal comfort. We can't afford houses. We can't afford much more than the basics of food. Yet we are working harder and achieving less. And when I say working harder, I direct people to Graeber's BS jobs to show you how the lie of capitalism is efficiency. It's not. The whole point of capitalism is to centralize capital in a few hands. Now, this can be fixed, and we don't have to go to a socialist or a communist model to fix this, but we have to use the tool of money. And money is just a tool. Money should not be a means or an end to itself. It should be the means to be able to do things like give everybody universal education, universal healthcare, make sure that everybody is gainfully employed to the level of their ability and comfort. Having anything less than full employment is an incredible waste of resource. The neoliberal policy has failed, and it's been failing for 35 years. The number of lives that it has impacted, the amount of progress it has stifled, because it's built upside down and it's built on a lie. The lie being that money trickles down. Money floats up. Rudd showed this with his payments. Now, those payments saved Australia from the global recession, no question. But Rudd was smart enough to know that you give it to the people on the bottom who spend it and the money floats up. And in that way, everybody benefits. Of course, idiots like Jerry Harvey whinged and moaned, even though he was one of the great beneficiaries of it. And of course, the same people who push for small government, can't survive without government handouts, with millions and millions of dollars of grants and interest-free government loans and working with in-government partnerships, etc., where they socialise the losses and privatise the profits. The scam is over. We know it's a scam. And all the best con artists will tell you is when they start to suspect, you get out quickly or you end up in jail.
And you're also left thinking, well, where will these agents for change actually come from? When you have a look at Thatcher and Reagan in the early 1980s, well, who is the equivalent of today? Well, Keir Starmer in the UK, well, no, he's not a big thinker. He doesn't seem to know what's going on, even though he's got one of the largest majorities in British history. Joe Biden, well, forget about that. He's on the way out anyway. And even if Kamala Harris did win the US election, she's not an agent for economic change anyway. And Trump is busy setting up a range of criminal-free market government enterprises, so nothing is going to happen there. And perhaps this process is the final disaster of neoliberalism, that the economy has been outsourced so much to private industry and to stakeholders' invested interests that it's almost impossible for governments to change economic thinking and look towards more equitable forms of economies. And of course, world economies, they don't change instantly. Neoliberalism didn't commence on a particular day in 1980 and then everything was different the following day. All of this change does take a long time, but there's no actual impetus for change at the moment. And governments are always looking to get back to the ways of old because they haven't really experienced anything different for a long, long time. And that's probably another reason why incumbent governments are having a lot of difficulty at the moment. Their ability to change economic circumstances have been hampered by the types of economies that we have at the moment. And when the economy falters, and it doesn't have to be too much, the electorate becomes totally unforgiving. And that's a lesson that we've picked up from the US election result, I think, that the electorate wants governments to change course and they want politics to change, but governments are restricted in how quickly they can make that change.
We have a ship of state that turns very slowly. There's a lot of moving parts, to use a cliche, that make reform hard. But it's not easy to change things. It took the Hawke and Keating government a few terms to make all of their major reforms. It took Howard a couple of terms to wreak the damage that he managed to do. But you have an electorate who is very impatient, whose wage already not going far enough, can't afford to wait another 3 years for the mechanisms that will bring prices down to be bought in. And you have, too, a media that's not prepared to explain properly why this is the case. They'd rather just kick into the Labor government and ignore the failings of the Liberal governments. So as a result, we're in a position where change is desperately needed, but no one has the courage, nor the will, nor the desire to effect it.
And just a final point on Australia's vote at the United Nations during the week. Australia did back a UN resolution demanding an end to the Israel occupation of Palestinian territories. And this is a change to the position that Australia has held for the past 20 years. And Australia voted with 157 countries in total. And there were 8 countries that voted against, including the usual suspects, United States and Israel, of course, and this is a significant change for Australia, and this follows on from the arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and we reported last week that change is slow, but then the final part happens very quickly. Now, we're not suggesting that this is absolutely going to be the case here, but this is a better reflection of what we'd expect from the Australian government. Now, it doesn't absolve them for all of their previous inaction and totally one-sided support for the state of Israel, and who knows, they might be actually receiving some terrible opinion poll numbers from Western Sydney and some part of the Melbourne areas, and that would not have been looking good for them. But I think overall this is a good start to support a UN resolution and vote for a UN resolution that calls for the end of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories.
It's about time, and it should have happened from the start. The second it became clear that this was not just retaliation for the October 7 attacks, that the October 7 attacks were being used as justification for something much more terrible, Australia should have stood up and said, wait, no, stop. That's enough. We don't follow this. Australia didn't do that for whatever reason, and I suspect that certain treaties and agreements were a part of that. But Australia's spent too long not decrying injustice. You could see the anguish on Penny Wong's face as the foreign minister, stuck in these awful compromises, wrestled with the idealist who in the past would have been first one out on the front lines demonstrating against it. Her reputation is gone. I don't think it, even with this type of stuff, I'm not sure it can come back, at least for a lot of people. Same with Anthony Albanese. His own branch voted against the government's policy on Palestine from a guy who would have moved the motion not that long ago. Again, I don't know that his reputation will recover, and any positive legacy they have will always be marked against, did you support a genocide? And if the answer is yes, and very little else you've done amounts to much. But this is the fact that they have, one, supported the arrest of Netanyahu as determined by the International Criminal Court, and demanded an end to the Israel occupation of Palestinian territory. This might go a little way in ameliorating the legacy, if not wiping it out completely. Amnesty International came out today calling it a genocide. So there's very little to be gained in the semantics of, oh, it's not a genocide, it's something else. It's a genocide, and they can scream all they like about Amnesty International being anti-Semitic. In this case, we're not being anti-Semitic. We're being anti-Netanyahu, we're being anti-Israeli government, we're being anti-genocide. And it means that the Netanyahu regime is coming to a horrible and permanent end, which it brought upon itself.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.